Welcome to this landscape painting basics tutorial. Our palette for this painting will consist of titanium white, lemon yellow, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, raw sienna, sap green, raw umber, and Prussian blue. I'll start by outlining the basic shapes with a charcoal pencil. I'm working on a wooden panel, and it's been prepared with a clear gesso. It's important at this early stage not to get caught up in small details, and it can be helpful to think about geometric shapes like circles, squares, triangles. Once my basic shapes are outlined, it's time to start painting. A good rule of thumb in landscape painting is to work from background to foreground. Here I'm painting the sky using titanium white, raw umber, lemon yellow, and yellow ochre. I'm covering most of the sky area, but leaving some of the major tree trunks uncovered. My goal is to finish most of the work on this area while the paint is still wet. Working wet into wet will allow me to create soft edges in the background. These soft edges in the background will help to create the illusion of distance. Still working from background to foreground, I'm adding a layer of trees. These trees are the furthest from the viewer, and because I'm working into a wet surface, I'm able to create a painterly effect with soft edges. Colors in the distance are almost always lighter in value and are less saturated than colors that are closer to us. Lighter values and lower saturation of color are two very important visual cues that your viewer will read as distance. When I feel satisfied that the value relationships are right, I'll start to add a little more texture and some color. Throughout this painting, you'll see that I'm using a number 4 flat brush, that's a small to medium-sized flat brush, and a liner brush. And that's really all that's needed for a painting this size. Over time, you'll find your own favorite brushes. And there's really no substitute for practice. The insight you gain from practice is invaluable. Through practice, you'll expand your mark-making vocabulary. A lot of factors affect the kinds of mark that your brush makes on the panel. You can vary the way that you load your brush, the amount of paint that you load onto your brush, which part of the brush touches the panel, and the amount of pressure that you touch the panel with. And because oil paints are so heavy and thick when they come out of the tube, you can use them to create texture on the surface of your painting. We'll talk more about when and how to use this technique a little later. You can also thin oils with liquid or linseed oil or another medium. With paint that has been thinned with a medium, you can make very delicate lines or even transparent glazes of color. Now when I change colors, I don't wash my brush with mineral spirits or brush cleaner. What I do is wipe my brush on a paper towel and then move on to the next color. This works when you're using colors that are close together on the color wheel or neutrals. but there will always be a little bit of paint left in your brush if you do this. So if you're transitioning between two colors that are opposite on the color wheel, like red and green or blue and orange, then you'll want to have two different brushes going. You'll want to have an orange brush and a blue brush in that case, because you don't want your colors to muddy up. If you want to learn more about color and relationships on the color wheel, there's a separate tutorial that explains this. Now I'm continuing to work from background to foreground, and I've worked my way up to some trees that are a little bit closer to the viewer. The color in the sky is still wet, and you'll see that I'm adding trees, and then to soften them, I'm going back with a dry brush after I've applied the paint, just to soften the edges and lighten the value a little bit. I'm picking up some burnt sienna for some of those pretty leaf details. So after the first layer is applied, I'll revisit the area several times. With each pass, I add a few more details, soften edges, add a little texture and color here and there, and I'm always looking at my reference picture for these details. In fact, my reference picture is always right next to my easel, and I spend more time looking at my reference picture than at the actual painting. Even though I study the reference picture very carefully and choose the details that I'll add to the painting, I'm purposely softening edges, lightening values, and using less saturated color in the distance. I'm choosing to emphasize lighter values, lower saturation, and softer edges because remember, these are the visual cues that your viewer will read as distance. It's not my goal to make an exact copy of the photograph. The photograph is beautiful in its own right, but I feel like the painting should be a little different. As artists, we get to make decisions about which details to leave out and which details to emphasize. We get to direct our viewer's journey through our painting. So again, I'm emphasizing lighter values, softer edges, and less saturated color in the distance. As I work my way toward the middle ground and foreground, I'll start to add more detail, a little more saturation and color, and some sharper edges. Sharper edges and more contrast are a way to draw your viewer's attention to a certain part of your painting. You should always be mindful of the journey that your viewer takes as they enter your painting. Pay attention to where the eye goes when you first look at your painting. Sometimes you'll need to set it aside for a day or two and look at it again with a fresh perspective. We're almost to the end of part 1 of this landscape painting basics tutorial. To summarize, we've learned that some of the visual cues that indicate distance are lighter values, softer edges, and lower saturation of color. We've learned that sharper edges and areas of a higher contrast will draw the viewer's eye. This will help in making decisions about which details to add and which details to leave out of your painting. And we're working from background to foreground throughout the painting. In part 2, we'll work in the middle ground and concentrate on brushwork. And then in part 3, we'll do some glazing to create realistic water. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this landscape painting basics tutorial and picked up some tips and techniques you can use in your own work. If you have any questions or ideas for a tutorial you'd like to see in the future, please send them my way. See you next time!